In the frozen skies above Nazi Germany, young American airmen had only minutes to live. Flak exploded all around them, sharp steel tearing through aluminum, flesh, and bone. But deep inside a quiet English airbase, one man refused to watch them die. He wasn't a pilot. He was a doctor, and his invention would change the fate of thousands. By 1943, the war in Europe had become a brutal contest of endurance. Every morning, hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators lifted off from bases across England, heading for targets deep inside Nazi-occupied Europe. Their mission was to bomb factories, rail lines, and military sites, to cripple the German war machine. But few made it back. The German flak guns were merciless. Black puffs of smoke filled the air at 25,000 feet, each burst sending hundreds of razor-sharp steel fragments tearing through the bomber formations. Crews called it the Black Wall of Death. Each mission, dozens of aircraft were shot down. The ones that returned often carried wounded men, gunners with shattered limbs, pilots slumped over controls, radio operators bleeding on the floor. And when the stretchers reached the base hospital tents, Colonel Malcolm Grow was waiting. Colonel Malcolm C. Grow wasn't an ordinary surgeon. He was Chief Medical Officer of the 8th Air Force, the unit leading America's air war over Europe. Grow had spent months treating men torn apart by flak, shrapnel wounds to the chest and stomach, the kind no one survived. He saw strong, healthy young men die in minutes from injuries a small layer of protection could have stopped. Every night the sound of engines haunted him. He knew tomorrow more bombers would take off, and more would never return. He decided something had to change. The Army had already tested early flak suits before the war. But they were heavy, clumsy, and offered little real protection. Most were abandoned. Grow, however, believed there was a better way. He began studying fragments removed from the wounded, the jagged steel from German 80D miter shells. He noticed a pattern. Most deadly fragments were small, traveling at lower speeds than bullets. That meant, if you used the right kind of light steel, you could stop them. It was a revolutionary thought. But to the military bureaucracy, it was nonsense. Armor, they said, was for tanks, not men. Grow didn't care. He quietly began working on his own design. One weekend, while visiting London, Grow stopped at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's European Armor exhibit. There, among shining helmets and breastplates, he saw something extraordinary. Medieval chainmail and plate armor, light enough for knights to move and fight in. The idea struck him like lightning. What if the past held the answer to the future? What if the key to saving modern airmen lay in the design of ancient armor? Grow began sketching ideas. He wanted a vest, not bulky but flexible, that could cover the chest and stomach, the places most often hit by shrapnel. It needed to be strong enough to stop steel, but light enough for a man to climb into a bomber with. He reached out secretly to the Wilkinson Sword Company, famous for crafting blades for British officers. If anyone understood strong, flexible steel, it was them. Together, they began experimenting with overlapping manganese steel plates, thin, curved, and connected like the scales of a fish. Grow's small team worked late into the night, cutting, bending, and testing pieces of steel. They built a prototype and tested it against real flak fragments. When the first shard hit the armor and bounced off, Grow knew he was onto something. But the project was unauthorized. No orders, no funding, no approval. He was breaking military rules. If his superiors found out, it could end his career. Still, he kept going, because he knew every day young men were dying who didn't have to. By late 1943, the first vests were ready. They looked crude, a fabric shell filled with overlapping metal plates, each shaped by hand. Grow gathered a group of volunteer airmen. "This might save your life," he told them quietly, "but I can't promise it'll be easy to wear." They wore the new vests on their next bombing run over Germany. The mission was to hit Bremen, one of the most heavily defended cities in the Reich. Dozens of flak batteries waited below. As the bombers approached the target, the air filled with black smoke. The sky shook. A burst hit one B-17 dead center, and shrapnel ripped through the fuselage. When the bomber landed back in England hours later, medics rushed to the runway. The waist gunner was shaken but alive. His vest was dented and scarred, but the steel had stopped the fragments that would have torn into his chest. Grow examined it himself. "You would have been dead without this," he said. The man nodded, trembling. Word spread fast. Crews started asking for the Grow vest. At first, there were only a handful. Wilkinson Sword couldn't produce enough steel plates, and Grow had no official approval to expand production. But he kept pushing, writing reports showing proof, men who were alive because of his vest. Slowly, the Air Force began to listen. By early 1944, more bomber crews were issued the new armor. Missions that once cost dozens of lives now ended with men walking away, scarred but alive. Still, not everyone believed. Some officers claimed the armor added too much weight, that it would make men slower, less effective. Grow disagreed, and he was determined to prove it. One cold morning in February 1944, the 8th Air Force prepared for another massive raid, deep into the heart of Germany. Grow himself stood on the flight line, watching the men climb aboard, his vests strapped over their uniforms. He saluted as the engines roared and the bombers lifted off into the gray winter sky. Hours later, when the planes returned, the medics counted far fewer casualties than expected. The armor had done its job again and again. Grow didn't smile often during the war, but that day he did, because for the first time he knew he had beaten the flak. The winter of 1944 turned England into a land of fog, smoke, and constant thunder from the skies. Every morning, the drone of bomber engines rolled over the fields as men climbed into their aircraft, uncertain if they would see another sunrise. But something was changing. Inside the hospital tents, Colonel Malcolm Grow began noticing fewer stretchers covered with blankets. More men were coming back alive. The flak wounds that once tore through their chests and stomachs were now shallow bruises, dents in metal instead of flesh. The secret vest was working. Grow documented everything. He photographed the damaged vests, took notes on where they stopped shrapnel, and recorded the names of men who survived because of them. Each report was sent up the chain of command, pleading for official approval. But bureaucracy moved slower than war. Some generals still doubted him. They argued the vest was too heavy, too expensive, and too unconventional. Doctors shouldn't design armor, one colonel remarked. But Grow wasn't a man who waited for permission. He had already saved lives, and that was his proof. Meanwhile, in the freezing skies over Germany, the airmen were fighting for their lives. The 8th Air Force had launched Big Week, a massive bombing campaign meant to destroy the German aircraft industry. Hundreds of bombers flew in formation, braving flak so thick it looked like a black storm cloud. Sergeant Paul McGuire, a 21-year-old gunner from Ohio, wore one of Grow's steel vests. As the formation neared Leipzig, an explosion rocked his B-17. A burst of metal fragments ripped through the fuselage, shattering the gun mount and striking him square in the chest. McGuire was thrown backward, breath knocked out, pain surging. But when he looked down, he was still alive. The steel plate over his heart was dented inward like a fist mark. When his crew landed safely back in England, the vest was shown to Grow. The steel had caught the full force of the flak burst. Without it, the gunner would have died instantly. Grow placed the vest on a table and said quietly, "This is what we fight for." Word of the miracle vest spread beyond the airfields. Crews began writing home about it, and officers started demanding them for their men. Finally, the U.S. Army Air Forces gave official approval for mass production. The Wilkinson Sword Company, along with several American manufacturers, began producing the armor by the thousands. The new vest was officially named the flak jacket. It consisted of overlapping manganese steel plates sewn into a canvas vest that covered the chest, sides, and lower abdomen. It weighed about 16 pounds, heavy, but not unbearable. Most importantly, it worked. By the summer of 1944, every bomber crew in the 8th Air Force was equipped with them. Casualty rates from flak dropped dramatically. For the first time since the air war began, the wounded were outnumbering the dead. Grow's idea had changed everything. But not everyone knew who to thank. To most crews, the flak jacket was just another piece of gear handed out before missions. Few realized it was born out of one surgeon's relentless determination and sleepless nights among the wounded. Grow continued his work, refining the design and sharing data with other units. He wanted to develop protection for pilots, gunners, and even ground troops. The war was far from over, but the tide was turning, not just in the skies, but in the mindset of the military. During one inspection visit, General Jimmy Doolittle, the legendary pilot who had led the raid on Tokyo, personally met Grow. Doolittle listened as the surgeon explained how the armor had saved hundreds of men. The general simply said, "Colonel, you've done more than most of us to win this war." It was one of the few times Grow felt recognized. As 1945 arrived, the Allies were closing in on victory. Missions over Germany continued, but fewer bombers were being lost. When the war finally ended in May, the 8th Air Force had paid a terrible price. Over 26,000 men killed. Yet thousands more were alive because of a quiet surgeon's defiance. After the war, Grow's contribution was finally acknowledged. He was awarded the Legion of Merit for his work and promoted to Major General. But for him, medals didn't matter. What mattered were the men who walked away from their planes, alive, because of that vest. In the years that followed, his design became the foundation for all modern body armor. The flak jacket evolved into the ballistic vest worn by soldiers, police officers, and even medics. Every time a modern vest stops a bullet or a fragment, it carries a piece of Grow's legacy, a reminder that compassion can be as powerful as courage. In interviews years later, one surviving airman recalled, "We used to think armor was for tanks. Then we realized, thanks to Colonel Grow, that our lives were worth protecting too." Grow retired from the Air Force in 1949, but his impact never faded. Today, in museums and archives, a few of his original steel vests still exist, dented, scarred, and silent witnesses to the lives they saved. If you look closely, you can still see the marks of flak that never found its target. And somewhere in the cold skies over Europe, where young men once fought for survival, the echo of engines still carries a message born from one man's determination. That no soldier, no airman, no human being should die without a chance to be saved. In a war of destruction, one surgeon's invention proved that saving lives could be the greatest victory of all.